Welcome to this week's Live with Littlewood with me, Mark Littlewood, Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Another week, another huge batch of stories for us to get through as we try and pilot a free market and liberal course through the world's events. Is it finally time to unilaterally undo the Northern Ireland Protocol and to have a properly united kingdom post-Brexit? What can be done to halt or reverse the cost of living crisis? Prices rising at their fastest for 4 decades. Or is the Governor of the Bank of England, Andrew Bailey, right when he claims that policymakers are helpless in the face of inflation? And what about free speech? What's the state of that in the United Kingdom at the moment? Have we got the balance right, or are we sleepwalking into some sort of cancel culture? Sometimes those who seem to argue for free speech for them seem a little less willing to give it to others. Might they end up with egg on their face, just like Margaret Thatcher's statue in Leicester? All of that's coming up on this week's Live with Littlewood. Kaboom, kapow, welcome to this week's Live with Littlewood with me, Mark Littlewood, Director General here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We've got another stellar lineup of guests to pilot our way through some of the big issues of the week. Coming up later in the show, Lucy Harris, former Conservative MEP, now a political consultant. I'll be asking her views on how we tackle the inflation and cost of living crisis. I'm going to be joined by Darren McCaffrey, GB News political editor and presenter, about possible solutions to inflation. And from the home team, our very own head of Regulatory Affairs, Victoria Hewson, will be here to discuss the Northern Ireland Protocol and whether the time has come for the UK to act independently and unilaterally to solve the problem before us. But first up, a very warm welcome back to the Live with Littlewood show to Baroness Claire Fox, founder and director of the Academy of Ideas. Claire. Great to see you. Thanks for coming in. Thanks for coming in. Now, we're going to kick off on what we're calling freedom of expression. God, I don't know who writes these headlines. Absolutely appalling. Look, this is just the latest rather trivial incident, I guess. The University of Leicester had a statue of Margaret Thatcher, only been up for a short while before some chap started throwing eggs in it. I gather he's the Deputy Director of the Arts Centre at the University of Leicester. I mean, no huge big deal, but what does it tell us about the state of public debate and freedom of expression in the UK, Claire? Something that's a big concern of yours.
Well, it lacks a certain imagination, let's put it that way. You could tell he's a bit older, that it was kind of eggs. And,
should be a milkshake if you, isn't
yeah,
that's
exactly.
all the rage for the youngsters these days.
Look, I spent most of my youth arguing against Thatcher and Thatcherism, and was very firmly on the side of the miners, we'll all be delighted to know. But I think it's a sign of the times that the great act of political rebellion is throwing eggs at a statue. It's a statue.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Do you know what I mean? You do think it's a bit lame. And of course it's a bit lame as well because, you know, if you're really going to go for the statues, you now have to drag them down and drag them along and throw them in rivers to be making any kind of an impact, as we saw in Britain.
Yeah, egg throwing's a bit. Yeah,
I mean, you know, sort of like sad.
Yeah,
but
very sad.
On the free speech point, I think there's a genuine problem that this is the way that people react to ideas or individuals whose ideas you disagree with is to kind of like be angry and outraged and to do things like that. And so although, as you say, this is a trivial example, I think that the fact that there's an atmosphere in academia that would mean that were you to be the kind of 18 or 19-year-old who, by the way, I think might be a bit sad who says Thatcherism is something I'd like to explore. Well, you're not going to do that at the University of Leicester if your, you know, tutor is going around throwing eggs at the statue, right? That's why it's a problem. And
I mean, is this? I'm not actually quite sure where the law stands here. It's presumably illegal to throw eggs at a statue. Is criminal damage, or potentially, isn't it? I don't know. But it seems to me it speaks to a paucity in public discourse. Has that got worse, or am I just getting older and more whingy and gammony with each passing year? Or back in the day, did we not actually have proper debates about Thatcherism and the miners, or is it always just been this rather trivial performative art, basically?
You might well be getting older and more gammony. But
I probably am,
two things can exist at once.
And I can't be right.
Yeah, you can be right, exactly. I actually think that there's an intolerance about other people's ideas that expresses them itself in a way that describes people who you disagree with as evil, who shouldn't exist, who should have eggs thrown at them, who should be torn down from the public arena. I think it says something about our war on the past. And I do think these are contemporary problems. I don't think they always existed. I think things have degenerated. And I think that the left that I'm from, but the identitarian left, as has presently emerged, has led the way in terms of trying to shut down any oppositional ideas at all. And I think the fact that you can just say, well, it was Thatcher, so what do you care, right? Misunderstands that this was a highly influential Prime Minister who, whether you like her or not, or what her legacy was, has a huge influence on British politics. And he should be able to, if you're disagreeing with her, demonstrably, intellectually demolish that, not throw eggs at it.
And is this, I mean, okay, we're probably overpicking on this one chap in this one incident, but is this the nature of political discourse now? I mean, I was kind of, when Extinction Rebellion were all over the place, it seemed to me to be more of a kind of jolly day out and a festival. You can do a bit of poetry reading and, you know, dance a jig and, you know, knit your own quiche or whatever else they would do. But there wasn't much actual debate or discussion about climate, environment policy. It was all just a sort of, you know, it was kind of, you know, a festival.
The nature of politics has changed to become much more performative. So that's kind of what you're saying. But it's also the case that, for example, I have defended the right to protest against the increasing incursions on that right by the Conservative government, which, by the way, I think is equally performative, because a lot of the laws they're bringing in are as much about saying, in a kind of virtue signalling way, we're going to clamp down on protest. You do think you've got huge swathes of public order legislation that you can use, but the police aren't using it, right? And whether that's a politicised police force or a sanitised police force, whatever it is, that's the problem. Not just bringing in more laws, more rules, because that's actually going to have an impact on all of us. When you talk about Extinction Rebellion, it's also a case that these days, going on a demonstration was, on the one hand, making a loud noise so that you could have your views heard, but it was about a way of attempting to win over your fellow citizens to an idea. You were demonstrating your displeasure, but there was always, I mean, like people like me selling newspapers or leafleting, but you'd be saying to the public, you know, this is why you should join our side and why you shouldn't just be walking along the pavements. Whereas, indeed, these demonstrations that are so performative basically say the public are rubbish, they don't get it, so we're going to ruin their lives as much as possible and make it impossible for them to get to work, to do anything. So it's anti-democratic. And then the police stand there kind of going, we don't know what to do, what do we do?
Why do the police not know what to do? I mean, once the line's been crossed, and I don't know, you've glued yourself to the road or something, I mean, it's now not a matter of protest, is it? You're now blocking the public highway and you should be removed.
But most of these protests break laws that presently exist. The police also don't want to be unpopular. So there's this idea that, you know, well, we can't be seen to be too heavy-handed because we might get the wrong kind of headlines. So they're also being performative. I think there is some truth, sadly, in the idea that in some instances the police actually are sympathetic to the demonstrators. And I do think we saw that particularly around...
Well, that's not a problem, is it?
Well, it is if their sympathies are, I mean, individually they can think what they want. I mean, that's not the point. The point I'm making is that they sort of think, well, you know, I think it was terrible what happened to George Floyd, and maybe these Black Lives Matter protests have a point. And then on other demonstrations, you see them going in really hard, and you think, oh, you didn't like them ones. No, you're not meant to think like that, because you're meant to have consistent policing that, if you want, is the strong arm of the state when it's necessary. And I don't think that any of us can feel entirely sure that the police it's a bit like impartiality in the BBC. You know, you can say you're impartial as much as you want, but when you really know what they really think, and so many of the police officers are now going on courses in, you know, gender identity and how to be diverse and all the rest of it, you know that they've kind of bought into a lot of this stuff as a way of softening the way they're seen by the public, but as a consequence of which they are neither doing their jobs nor seen to be fair.
And in terms of public debate, I mean, you do a fantastic job at the Academy of Ideas, you know, run this, the Institute of Ideas Festival every year, and this is genuinely people who disagree. It's a wide variety of different voices, left, right, libertarian, socialist, green, anti-green, a whole lot. But this is a dying phenomenon, isn't it, in the United Kingdom? I mean, really what it's all about now is, you know, shouting at people on Instagram and Twitter, and if you or gluing yourself to a pavement, I'm really worried about the state of public discourse. And I thought, I mean, obviously, Lively Littlewood here on the YouTube channel, highly civilised, intelligent conversation, but a rarity I'm sort of feeling in the wider, which is all just sort of screaming and shouting and hurling abuse at each other. How have we got to this? You would have thought the access to sort of social media should have encouraged public debate, not just lead to a slanging match.
People have actually lost confidence that they know how to win the arguments very often. The only thing they've got is the slogan or the meme. And, you know, if you talk particularly to younger people, you'll find that they can repeat the mantra, but they can't go much beyond it. And by the way, I think this is true on the left and the right, and on all, you know, on all sides, as it were. I mean, even people who will argue in defence of free speech often simply do use it in, I know it's disparaging, but in that kind of culture warsy way, you know, just go, I'm free speech, I hate the woke. And then when you actually explore it a bit, they can't get much further than that. You know, I'm opposed to Extinction Rebellion, they are, you know, green fascists, or something. And then you kind of go, all right, let's talk about it, and then they can't go further. In other words, depth, any kind of analysis that goes beyond that sort of tick box way of expressing which side you're on, it seems to me is being lost. And that's because you can lose the habit, the art of debate. And one of the things that happened is that we demonised people we disagree with. That's where, to go back to our Thatcher example, where you demonise them in such a way that you delegitimise them. So what you say is, if everybody's a fascist, right, if everybody's an alt-right white supremacist, I mean, who wants to talk to an alt-right white supremacist? I don't. But if you describe, you know, huge swathes of public opinion as alt-right or as fascist, then you don't have to bother with them, right? And therefore you never engage with people that you disagree with. And I think that you literally forget how to debate.
Right. Well, let's have a debate then. You're from the left of the spectrum. Our next guest is from the centre-right of the spectrum. Please give a very warm welcome to former Conservative MEP and political consultant Lucy Harris. Lucy, hi. Hi, thanks for joining us, Lisa. So what's your take on it? You know, you're a little bit younger than Claire and I. Are we just grumpy oldsters, you know? Or is public debate and discourse just in a you know, really shallow position at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I think we've lost this ability to have goodwill to our opponents and see that, you know, we may disagree in terms of how we get there, but at the end of the day, we always have this concept of wanting to, you know, strive to the same goal. You know, we want ordinary people to have better livelihoods. We want them to have a better standard of living or a better quality of life. But it's when it comes to the detail and negotiating how you get there is where the confusion and arguments and the slagging off often happens. And I think that's a real shame, because at the end of the day, and I've said that 3 times now, we are at the end of the day, so it's a great way to initiate my conversation. But we need to have those conversations, to have that ability to find a solution that is applicable to as many people as possible. And you can only do that through a debate that is, you know, a negotiated one with goodwill at the head of it.
But this is a real rarity, isn't it? I mean, you know, both of you were veterans of the Brexit campaign, and you know, I voted for Leave, but it struck me that there were some good arguments and some bad arguments on both sides. I didn't believe that you had to be crazy or mad in order to vote Remain. I could see the case for it, and I balanced it up. But has politics now just become, Claire, just completely divisive? You're over on one side or the other. You're either, you know, Tory or Labour, Brexit or Remain, Trump or anti-Trump, and there isn't a sort of zone of possible agreement in the middle where people can sort of say, well, you know, I agree with Claire Fox about halfway. Maybe she goes a bit far on this or not far enough on that. No, it's become binary, hasn't it?
It's become binary, and I can't stand it. I mean, I can't stand it on, as it were, our side any more than anything else. But just to go back to the Brexit issue, I think that, you know, I wasn't a hardcore Eurosceptic. I was Eurosceptic for years, but I hadn't campaigned for a referendum. Well, what happened was, in the build-up to the referendum, and then, of course, afterwards, when I realised that anyone who was just decided to vote leave in a legitimately called referendum was demonised as Neanderthal, xenophobic knuckle draggers, you know, you immediately, I started saying, oh, what are you talking about? And then immediately you get cast into that. And so I think I can understand that people get defensive, because if you get called those names, I don't mean just me, I mean people then start lashing out. But the difficulty we then have is that we are never going to solve anything if we don't have robust, lively argument about the future and what we do about it, on the same side even, without going, there's a line that you've crossed. I mean, you will know, sorry, just very quickly, because I don't agree with everything that everyone says, and we've seen this with the Ukraine war, people will say, oh, has she turned into a shill now? She's a controlled opposition. These are people who were Brexiteers with me. And you think, oh, for God's sake, we are allowed to disagree.
And Lucy, do you think on that we're now doing a lot more of playing the man or the woman rather than the ball?
Yeah,
I mean, I would say at the IEA, the biggest complaint that we get from who funds you? As if.
It always goes down to that, doesn't
as
it?
if, you know, I'm at heart, you know, opposed free market liberalism. I'm only saying this because, you know, that's what my paymasters want. But it's that, again, Claire, going back to your point, was about delegitimisation. We don't really want to engage in the IEA's, you know, arguments or what Littlewood thinks, and we just want to say he's probably up to no good.
I mean, and it also sort of goes to the point that people can't have their own opinions. They all move in a group. You know, this is the IEA being paid for by some shady donors to say an explicit and a direct thing. That's not the case. You know, lots of people have, I'm sure, very different opinions in the IEA, but of course, you know, there are also situations where people with lots of money have very different opinions and do want to affect the world. Back to the original point that we mentioned about that concept around having, you know, having that difficulty when it comes to the diversity, diversity and that sort of unjust representation of ordinary people. I think it does go down to big changes in society and how we deal with those, and people do get emotional when it comes to having to justify as what they see as their identity, their ability to demonstrate themselves with the world that they live in. For example, you know, as a Brexiteer, it was really difficult back in the day to say in a liberal world. I used to work in publishing very, very much back in the day. It was very difficult to say that you were somebody who voted for Brexit without instantly being associated with that press and media narrative that you were somehow nefarious in your sort of reasons for doing so. And I think that's where it goes wrong. The reasons for doing so are often painted as nefarious when really they're actually a positive thing that you've thought about, and that often goes undermined.
And what do you think, Lucy, about, you know, new powers we need to crack down on things? I mean, again, aren't the political elite as guilty of performative art as the demonstrators? Well, I mean, just get on and sort it out. I mean, we've got the right rules in place to prevent people from blocking the streets or you know, throwing paint over people. These are all illegal anyway. It's just, why do we need new legislation?
Yeah, I think it's obviously to show that we're doing something about it.
Well, why don't you show you're doing something about it by doing something about it?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think back to Claire's point, absolutely, you have to have, you know, you don't want to be liked as the police. The police are there to enforce law, and they could have already done a lot in lots of those Extinction Rebellion situations. But I'm more worried about when it comes to free speech is like the online harms bill, for example, where we're telling companies, small companies, big and large, if you have you know, the ability to enable conversation, you're then going to have to police private conversations. And that's where I'm worried. I'm worried how that's going to stunt innovation, how that's going to stunt people's ability to debate ideas, like Claire knows is so important to further those negotiations in society to make sure that we have the right outcome for people.
Claire, I've got to kind of a rough theory that there's just a permanent race between the kind of entrepreneurs and individuals on the one hand and regulators on the other, and so all these debates will happen on Twitter, and then the regulators will try to regulate them away. Do you think, in practical terms, these sort of online, safety moves and this policing of the internet, can it really happen in the United Kingdom, or again, is this just the governing authorities showing that they're clamping down on, terrorism or extreme thoughts of that? It won't really stick because the technology just doesn't really work like that.
Well, I think the technology could well thwart their plans in a practical sense. I think that's true. But I do think that if they're using legislation to send messages, it's which messages. And I think that if you live in a society where safetyism is the main message you want to put out, we've had 2 years of that with the lockdown measures, but prior to that we've had the whole precautionary principle as a dominant overarching way that we understand the world. Now this is the online safety bill, which boasts that it's going to be the safest place in the world to be online. Safety is all, and they're threatening the technology companies that if they do not remove things, now that then they will be fined and so on. Now,
colossal fines as well. Yeah,
fines.
we're not talking about
and also they're actually talking about put people in prison, right? So what that leads to is risk aversion. So you're going to have a situation whereby you've got to decide whether to let something be said online or not. You're going to go, well, maybe this is going to upset someone, so I better be careful. This legal but harmful notion is very dangerous. And I think that Lucy's absolutely right that what you get to a situation is that whole swathes of legislation become stifling. And that's where you then say, well, I mean, it might not directly influence innovation, but how can you have a culture in which you say, let's innovate, think the unthinkable, be daring, take risks, let's push the barriers.
But make sure you don't offend anyone.
Right, but be careful in case it's legal but harmful.
Yeah.
And you might get, and you think about socialising the young into those messages, then it means that you've basically got a cautious atmosphere. And that's why on university campuses, it's no coincidence that the anti-free speech form that it takes is safe spaces. Now the government says it wants to clamp down on the safe space Generation Snowflake on university, but it acts like Generation Safe Space when it comes to legislation.
Well, do you understand what legal but harmful might mean, Lucy?
Well, exactly. I mean, how are you going to
talk about open
this?
To interpretation?
I
right?
know. Are they going to produce a massive dictionary of what can and cannot be said? And I think if I remember correctly, in the European Union, Claire, you went through a very similar situation with those guys. Were we going to publish a book of things that could and could not be said in the European Parliament, and then do all the different translations for it? So it was going to be a mammoth.
They actually said, I can't even remember what the word was. But what happened was somebody used a word, which was a completely innocuous word, and the chair in front of everyone said, that word is not allowed here. It is not allowed. We have a list. And we queried, well, how do you know? And they said, there is a book in which you can see the words. So I then made a quick speech saying, can we have the book, please? We need to know which words. And of course it's a joke, and you associate that with the kind of bureaucratic nonsenses that goes on in the European Parliament.
Well, you must be
we left the European Parliament, and then I come back and find, domesticate the law,
well,
and instead we get the online safety.
The online harm bill actually does reflect a lot of the stuff and a lot of the legal connotations of the bill that's going, the bill going through the EU Parliament right now. So it's a massive reflection of what they're doing. So we're in it together, unfortunately, when it comes to that legislation. But what I always thought was quite interesting was who decides what is right to say and what is wrong to say. And in that case, our EU overlords were definitely deciding that situation. But what about now? Who is deciding? And that's what worries me. Where are the people, and who are the people trying to tell us what we can and cannot say, and how is it decided? Why is it on media, you're not allowed to say certain lines of thought?
Sure.
Who is...
But the two of you must be missing the European Parliament terribly. I saw the interpretive dance routine in the European Parliament last week. Great entertainment. That's how we're not going to express ourselves in Parliament through the medium of mime, right?
Not a day goes by. But I thought it was really funny because even the kind of most pro-Europhile MEPs Tories looked mortified.
It was utter cringe.
But I wanted to just quickly say something about misinformation, because we've a lot of concentration on the legal but harmful. But misinformation is one of the real kind of dodgy ones in this online safety bill, I think, because you know, we're all familiar with, and I can't cope with, the proliferation of conspiracy theory nonsense that you can all see online. We're all fed up of it, whether it's about Ukraine and Russia, or it's about, you know, the vaccines or whatever it is. Right, it drives me mad. But the best way to deal with that is to shine the light on it. Otherwise, I mean, who is going to decide on what is misinformation? I mean, I made a point in the Lords the other day and said, well, will passages from the Bible count? I mean, you can't get more misinformed when it comes to truth than bits of the Bible. I mean, transubstantiation, I'm a Catholic. I mean, is that misinformation, or does that count? No, but the reason I'm saying it is because who gets to decide what is misinforming or not?
Well, Claire and Lucy, you've helped us crack the problem of freedom of speech in just 25 minutes, so thanks for that. We're going to move on to some even harder problems now. If you're watching the show and enjoying it, please hit the like, thumbs up button. Also, if you're not yet a subscriber, please hit that subscribe banner and the notification bell down below. That way you'll be kept abreast of all IEA upcoming content. But we've solved freedom of speech. To help us solve another thorny problem, the Northern Ireland Protocol, please give a very warm welcome to the IEA's very own Head of Regulatory Affairs, Victoria Hewson. Hey Victoria, thanks for joining us. So that's good. We've solved freedom of expression in 25 minutes. Now we're going to have 15 minutes or so to put to bed the Northern Ireland problem. Victoria, you wrote a research paper for us this week on the Northern Ireland Protocol. We'll make sure that we link to that in the show notes below. You're saying that we've got to resolve this now really through, or at least it'd be justified for the UK to take unilateral action to solve the problem that's occurring in Northern Ireland. Just explain to our viewers, what is the problem that's occurring?
Well, the problem is that in order to extricate ourselves from the EU in the face of not just the obduracy from the European Commission and the European Union itself, but also all of the resistance in our own national parliament, where our negotiators have been backed into a corner, we ended up signing up to a rather onerous arrangement, including the Northern Ireland Protocol, whereby we essentially had to institute a full international trade border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, two parts of the same country. Northern Ireland relies on Great Britain for basically all of the goods in its market, consumer goods, food, manufacturing, supply chains. And so the impact of that has been quite strikingly bad, negative for manufacturers in Northern Ireland, who potentially are having to pay tariffs on goods that they are bringing just across the Irish Sea from Great Britain. Consumer goods, you have to get veterinary certificates for goods. Technically speaking, sausages and chilled meats would just be outright banned. We haven't implemented that bit yet, much to the chagrin of the European Commission. And the cost, one economist at the University of Ulster has put it at £850 million a year, which is around about 2% of the entire GDP of Northern Ireland, which is already one of the poorest parts of the United Kingdom. British taxpayers are paying around £500 million so far just to implement the infrastructure and the support services to try and make this work. So it's a pretty dire situation, and that's before we even got onto the constitutional question, which has driven the unionist parties out of the devolved government in Northern Ireland, which means, of course, that what the protocol has delivered in the exact opposite of its stated intentions is bringing the institutions of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement to a standstill.
Claire, I know you've got to leave us shortly, but I'm sure you can solve in a few sentences the Irish problem, can't you? You've previously been very sympathetic, I think, to a united Ireland. When we got Brexit over the line, it sort of seemed that we sort of thought, oh, well, there is this sort of Northern Ireland problem, we'll sort that out later on, and we've now got to that part of the road. What is the solution here?
Well, first of all, it's a brilliant summation of where we are. I think all of us who kind of went along with the Brexit deal, although I was a no dealer, as it were, at that time, knew that there was some real problems with it, and whether that was fisheries, but in this instance we knew there was a constitutional problem. But it was actually that or no Brexit at all, because it was such a ferocious fight back. That's why we did it. That's why we accepted it. Anyway, we are where we are. In terms of the situation as I explain it, I still support United Ireland, but that's got nothing to do, who cares what I think about that, right? The United Kingdom, as the United Kingdom, voted to leave the European Union. The whole of the United Kingdom. And you cannot be in a situation where a bit of the United Kingdom, as
still in the EU, really,
it's in the EU. I mean, it's not just a little in effect. I mean, it really will be in the EU. It will be answerable to the European Court of Justice. Its laws will be made outside of itself. It is not, therefore, part of the United Kingdom. Now, for me, it's if you are going to, for example, in the future, if there was a demand for a border poll, if the people of Ireland made a decision, blah, 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 that's not to be used in any way to undermine the democratic mandate of the 2016 referendum. And that's the way I see it, right? And I find it utterly galling that people try and say that the protocol is what you need in order to defend the Good Friday Agreement. It's the very opposite. The protocol is actually a barrier to allowing the United Kingdom to remain united. So, you know, what happens in the future in Ireland is a whole separate story. But however, it's inevitably the case that because Sinn Féin have done reasonably well and are likely to get elected in Southern Ireland, people are just using this almost as a threat, and what we end up doing is abandoning the North. I mean, what on earth could be worse than the United Kingdom splitting over Brexit? If that happens in a different matter, it would be in a different time. That's all different.
So you with Victoria, the time has now come for UK unilateral action here. Some people would say that the risk here is it then sort of unravels the whole Brexit exit withdrawal agreement. We get a trade war, God knows what else. But do you think the UK should now just fix it and, you know, to hell with it with what the EU thinks?
I'm actually concerned that Liz Truss has not gone far enough rather than anything else. I think that we're at a situation where this has been a fudge by the UK government, no, not blaming anyone else, who have seen the writing on the wall in relation to the EU, and their refusal to accept effectively Brexit for Northern Ireland. And I would have been with Lord Frost, who I just heard him make a speech in the House of Lords, which was excellent and to point. I think that they need to unilaterally do something now. And the reason why the DUP have been quite hard line on this is, apart from anything else, they've just said, we're not listening to you anymore, we need to see action. And they've got a point, you know, because every time, anyway, I mean, I remember Michael Gove, you know, and everybody else saying, oh, it's all right, the Internal Markets Bill will deal with this. There was an opportunity then, and it was one of the first speeches I made in the Lords, and then literally 2 days later Michael Gove said, oh, it's all right, we don't need it now. We talk about being marched up the hill and down again. So I think it's very important that we act now. And when you talk about a trade war, by the way, the EU threatens a trade war. Nobody else has threatened a trade war. A trade war is not inevitable. They don't have to have a trade war. But if they are going to say, we're going to have a trade war, so you're not allowed to act, I mean, just as an aside, on what world are we going to be in a situation where you're going to let somebody bully you like this? This is kind of Putin-esque, if you want. You know, if you don't do what we tell you, we'll invade you and start a war. Well, a trade war might not be that kind of a war, but if they're going to threaten a trade war, we cannot be cowed by that. Very important. And by the way, just because I've got to go, just how it relates to the free speech issue, if you try and have this conversation in a kind of, you know, try and explain it, go through it calmly and all the rest of it, you will literally be told that you are going to be responsible for bringing violence back into Ireland, destroying the Good Friday Agreement. You're guilty of nefarious reasons, that you're doing it for all sorts of underhand things. And the Academy of Ideas with a lot of young people, and we're running these things, you know, for young people, this thing coming up on called Living Freedom. And all of these things are to do with saying it's more complicated, it's not black and white, as you said, it's not binary. Let's talk about this in detail and disagree with me if you want, but don't accuse me or use labels to dismiss what I'm saying.
Claire, I knew you would be able to sort the Irish question and freedom of expression for us in just a little over half an hour. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Please give your thanks to Claire Fox. Claire, thanks so much.
Which way do I go?
Lucy and Victoria, stay with us. Shuffle up, I won't bite. I won't bite. Again, if you're enjoying the content, please make sure you hit the thumbs up, like, and leave a comment below. Express your own freedom of expression in the live chat or in the comments section below if you're watching this on catch up. Lucy, what's your take on this? Where were you on the Brexit deal? It sort of seemed obvious at the time that this would be a problem we'd have to return to later. But then I've got some sympathy that, I mean, people were kind of just bored into submission, right? The whole Brexit thing had been dragging on with this, sort of just get it done, right?
They were up against it when they were negotiating it, I would assume, to have accepted something like this. And a lot of the times when people say, you signed up to the protocol and now you're going back on it, it doesn't mean you can't make things better. And I think when it comes to this, you take a look at the EU, and it seems from where I'm standing, they are holding this for leverage, but they don't quite know what to do with it. I think they don't understand how the Irish problem is, the Irish border problem is. I don't think they understand the people in that area, whereas we've had a long history of having to manage and understand the situation ourselves. So when it comes to sort of negotiating, talking about this, they often resort back to computer says no mentality, which is nothing can be done. But where is the sense of jeopardy for the EU? Quite frankly, there is none, and they don't quite understand where the sense of jeopardy is. Yeah. My idea and thinking behind this is that they're probably going to wait and prolong the situation as much as possible until they've got a plan, and then they'll act. But they need to be told that this is a pressing situation. It means that people in Northern Ireland don't have the access to the tax breaks if we ever do get any tax breaks from the government.
I'm not holding my breath for that.
But,
it's not just a Northern Irish problem, is it? That's affecting the whole of the Western world.
It means that lots of things are, for ordinary average people in Northern Ireland are affected, and this undermines the Good Friday Agreement, which was the main goal of the protocol in the first place. It was not to undermine.
That's what it says on the face of it.
Yes.
Arguably, of course, the real main goal of it was to protect the single market, whilst using the threat of violence in Northern Ireland as leverage to try and bounce the UK government into terms that were more favourable to the EU.
Yeah, I mean the real risk
to be cynical.
Yeah, well, I mean to be cynical. I mean the real risk here for the European Union is if this comes back at them with egg on their face. They don't want to look as if they're having neighbourly squabbles or indeed worse with people who they're supposed to be working collaboratively. Can't speak. Long day. But look at Switzerland, for example. Switzerland walked away from their own negotiations with the European Union. And likewise, we've threatened to multiple times. So, this idea that they have to get on with them and for them to look as people who cannot deal with their neighbours is going to look bad.
Before I bring in our last guest, because I know he wants to share some thoughts on this, Victoria, I guess it falls on me to try and put the EU's position, which they're sort of saying, right, well, you guys at the UK have decided to leave. There is a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, but it's porous for all sorts of reasons related to peace. We want to be confident that the single market lives up to whatever regulatory and standards we have imposed. Without a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, we're at the mercy of whatever British regulations are. That would be their case, wouldn't it? Do we need to make some undertaking to them that if they were to find, truckloads of contaminated meat or bad electrical equipment, we would compensate them in some way? Because I'm not wholly unsympathetic to their position here, right?
Yes, the integrity of the single market is an important principle, and also not just principle. It's sort of central to the success of the single market is the trust that the member states and their citizens can have that things are working and are being consistently applied throughout. However, the EU is very critical that at present the UK hasn't fully implemented the protocol. They did an audit of our implementation so far and were horrified. It was not fit for purpose. We haven't invested in the systems suitably. We haven't got enough vets at the borders and so on. And I think people say that we've around about 30% implementation. We've implemented about 30% of the controls that the EU wants. However, there is no evidence whatsoever of any goods that are not authorised for the market in Ireland or the single market actually leaking across.
So it looks like it's a problem in theory rather than in practice.
It's a problem in theory, but not in practice, because actually there is not that much trade north and south. So if there were to be a sudden uptick in cargo going from Northern Ireland to Ireland, that would actually be quite obvious.
Yep.
And actually Liz Truss was very keen to stress that the proposals that she wants to put in place would be very respectful of the single market, and we would undertake to carry out the checks and take quite harsh sanctions against British businesses that were essentially smuggling goods across.
Okay, well, to help us finally crack this problem and shuffle up Victoria, but please give a very warm welcome to our last guest, political editor and presenter at GB News, Darren McCaffrey. Darren, good to see you. Right. So I've been on your show a few times where you ask me impossible questions, boots on the other foot this time, my friend. What the hell is going to happen here? I mean, the status quo is clearly can't hold, but when you start unpicking this, where do you think it leaves us?
Indeed, it's really, really tricky. And I grew up on the border, as in the Irish border, the one that divides south from north. And this is really, really tricky. Of course it is. You know what? There's essentially agreement, I think, across the board in Northern Ireland that the protocol as it is not working. We know that, frankly, like, say, Sainsbury's, for example, is not allowing goods into Northern Ireland now. It doesn't have any shops in the Irish Republic. What is the problem? And the single market, frankly, for the European Union, it's not gravity. It's not a physical thing where it's indisputable. The single market is a political setup. To say that the EU cannot be understanding or it cannot be flexible in the single market is frankly ridiculous. It's a bit like when there were suggestions that we were smuggling vaccines in to the Irish border from Europe. I mean, the idea that you would smuggle goods into Europe via Northern Ireland seems quite odd, given the fact it's an island. However, Northern Ireland is also a unique place, and I think the concern about the politics of this is around this idea of consent, if you like. And obviously unionists have made a very good case to say that there was no consent to what's happened with the Irish border and in the Irish Sea, and that they frankly don't support it, even though a majority probably of MLAs do support the protocol in some form or another. But then, and this is why it's tricky, because nationalists would turn around and say, well, there was no consent for the protocol in the first place either, or indeed potentially for Brexit. If you're going to get down to democracy, Northern Ireland doesn't operate on 52-48, it operates on agreement from both sides, and that's clearly not been the case with Brexit, and that's why there's real frustrations. And the British government are in a bind about this, but frankly, it's a bind that they made for themselves, but one I think they did to get Brexit over the line. It was the only way it was going to work.
I've got it cracked. We just get the Republic of Ireland to rejoin the United Kingdom. I'm told that probably won't fly.
Yeah, I
think
less than fly, as in it might start another skirmish. If you like.
That's just in pure economic terms. I mean, I'm sort of setting aside the extremely complex history of Ireland, but of course, we joined the European Economic Community together. Yeah. So this is the first time we really haven't been in a single market with the Republic, and that's just going to be an on-running problem, isn't it?
Of course it is, and it is one of these things where trade, obviously, with the UK for Ireland has slumped, and that's hit people down south quite a lot, and they are opening new trade routes to try and make up for that. But it also, it makes, and I was listening to what Claire had to say earlier on, I mean, I'm someone who thinks Irish reunification is a very, very, very long way down the line, simply because it is so damn complex. If you think the protocol is complex, wait until you start getting into the nitty-gritty of how reunification, not independence, reunification works. And in many ways, of course, Brexit makes that more difficult too, just as it makes Scottish independence more difficult.
Lucy, do you think there will be firm unilateral action here? We'll get it cracked just by sheer force of will from the British government?
I don't know. I mean, they've put a few suggestions plans out there, like trusted trader schemes and stuff like that, fast lanes, slow lanes, that sort of thing. But it's a liberalisation of the situation. What the government wants to do is to liberalise the border, and of course we can always expect the EU to want to make more bureaucracy. Their solutions are, of course, more certifications for food that's going to restaurants and to supermarkets, and that just causes more bureaucracy. And as we've seen from the issues that they're currently having, bureaucracy is the problem.
All right, well, we've got it licked. We've solved freedom of speech. We've pretty much solved the Irish question. We've got about 15 minutes or so left to solve another minor niggle of a problem that's afflicting the United Kingdom at the moment, the cost of living crisis. So we're seeing inflation at its highest rate for 4 decades. According to this session, bankrupt. Has the Bank of England really done its job? An independent Bank of England was supposed to use interest rates to tackle inflation, to keep inflation between 2 to 3%, but has not really done so, to put it mildly. We've printed a ton of money. Money supplies effectively doubled since 2007, and now the cost of living pinch is happening. Sure, a lot of it associated with energy, but we're clearly in a situation in which most people are going to feel poorer in a year's time than they are today, because they will actually be poorer. It won't just be that they feel it and think it. Victoria, this really is quite a severe difficulty and a problem at the moment, isn't it? I mean, I know Ronald Reagan was always saying the best way that any government wins an election, or he was re-elected president, do you feel richer than you were 4 years ago when you elected me? Well, the answer to the Conservative government is going to be an emphatic no for almost everybody, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. I really don't see things improving on that front for quite some time to come, which is going to be a real problem for the government coming into the next election. And it's a combination of inflationary pressures from loose monetary policy, COVID stimulus, shutting down the economy whilst continuing to pump money into it, and then the pressures on energy bills, on housing, everything coming together. And the governor of the Bank of England is just throwing his hands in the air and saying, oh, well, global pressures, it's the war in Ukraine, what could I have done? But actually, when you look at other countries, Switzerland has managed to keep inflation under control. Japan has very low inflation, and I'm not suggesting we are necessarily able to replicate Japan or Switzerland, sadly, unfortunately. But I think it's a problem actually with central bank independence, that the governor of the Bank of England can wash his hands of it and say, well, it's global forces. The Chancellor of the Exchequer can say, well, it's nothing to do with me, it's central bank independence, I can't tell them what to do. And meanwhile, no one is actually taking responsibility
so everybody gets poorer
for the monetary policy decisions over the past several years.
Darren, this is, a big topic. I'm an avid watcher of GB News, and this is a very big topic for all of your programmes on GB. It is the issue at the moment.
Beat the squeeze. Of course it is, because frankly, it is hitting people right now. And frankly, the government doesn't have an answer. I'm going to be sympathetic to the government here. It is in a complete and utter bind. I mean, frankly, there are a lot of people, and we saw this at PMQs today, who are struggling right now, who need help right now. And we're not talking about people who spend their life struggling. We're talking about ordinary folk who do get by
in normal times,
pretty decent standard of living, and things are only going to get worse. What does the government do about this, though? And we saw this again from Prime Minister's question time today. Frankly, Boris Johnson doesn't quite know what to do. He doesn't, clearly, or the Treasury, I should say, doesn't want to just pump lots more money into the economy and clearly, understandably, make things a hell of a lot worse and prolong this inflation crisis. But at the same time, there's a political calculation here and a reality that the government has to do something, or at least be seen to do something, have targeted action at those that are at the low end of the income scale. How you do that, a windfall tax, cut taxes generally, it's not easy. No one is saying it's easy, but I do think that, the government, Boris Johnson felt really under pressure today about the procrastination points, the dithering points, the bluster of not having an answer. And even his greatest fans would say the Prime Minister is not there with what to do on this.
Yeah, but maybe you can feed this back in GB News, Darren, because the issue to me, I totally get why there's a focus on energy bills at the moment, serious and going up substantially, and I think actually are accounting for a good chunk of the inflation is energy bills. But if you were just to take a pie chart of an average family household and look at their cost of living, by our calculations, let's take an almost exact average family income, household income of £30,000 per annum. You're probably paying, depends on your lifestyle and circumstances, but you're probably paying about £12,000 in tax, one way or another. Income tax, VAT, what have you, alcohol tax, all of the rest. I mean, that dwarfs the energy bill cost of living. So once you're taxing people to the max, and then rental prices and property prices in the UK are absolutely colossal. I know it's commonly said in London, 50% of your post-tax pay might go on rent. Well, once you've paid that amount of tax and that amount in rent, hardly surprising, it's difficult to get food on the table and heat and light afterwards. So what's your reasoning as to why the Conservatives haven't said, well, we're going to tackle the cost of living. The biggest cost of living is tax. We're going to lower it. In fact, they put it up.
Indeed, and so it's quite extraordinary listening to the Prime Minister today talking about Labour having put up taxes. I mean, frankly, this government, and we all know this, has got the highest burden of taxation for 70 years. I think ultimately, though, and this is where the government have to be a bit more honest with people, is that, you know, whether it is giving them a little bit more leeway on tax or not, but in the end, there's going to be pain. There's going to be economic pain. The only way to bring down inflation is with some economic pain. Mm-hmm. And I think they need to prepare the ground a hell of a lot more for voters about the fact that interest rates are going to go up, and probably more substantially, that we are potentially looking at a recession as well before the end of this year's out. We don't know what impact that might have on the jobs market. Yep. But, you know, why are they not doing more on tax? There is, I think, Mark, and, you know, you observe these things as well, there's just a sense that it's like Rishi's weird announcement about pronouncing that tax cut next year. Like, it just seems very focused on the next election rather than what might work now. And I just don't think that's sustainable. What I'm trying to say is, government at the moment having an answer, not having an answer is not sustainable, and they are going to have to do something.
Yep. Lucy, what's your take on this? Friedrich Hayek, the great economist, who's sort of the philosophical guru of the IEA, really, his thinking led to the IEA being established, said that taming inflation is like trying to catch a tiger by the tail. You know, once it's out of the cage, it's almost too late. You could look back to policy measures you could have taken 3 or 4 years ago. We can argue, should the Bank of England have put up interest rates, you know, earlier? But the longer you leave it, the more painful it is to treat it, possibly even impossible to treat it, as the Prime Minister's performance of PMQs today perhaps showed.
It's at a 40-year high, and it's only going to get worse before it gets better. However, reading around and seeing what Gerard Lyons has written recently in Con Home, he says that the focus shouldn't really be on, of course, inflation is an immediate and a sort of a short-term in respective of sort of, you know, your longer-term horizon of economic growth. And he says we should be putting more focus on economic growth over a long period of time. What does that mean? Rishi Sunak knew that this would be an issue, and he was probably quite concerned at the level of investment going into businesses to ensure that there was a level of economic growth over a long period of time. So what he did back in the day was that, if you remember, the super deduction tax, which encouraged businesses to take some of their profits and plug it back into their businesses to make sure that there was a level of innovation and economic growth for the UK. A few taxes that have been mentioned, you know, threaten that ability to do that. The ability to plug even more profits back into developing and innovating. And I think that's really what the focus should be on. Do we sort of have a short-termist approach to this situation and elongate the pain, or do we sort of look at this in a broader sense and think, can we shorten ourselves right now and start looking at how we can generate a momentum behind economic growth and then reap the rewards afterwards? And that's where I stand. I think Lord Frost also had a similar opinion.
But to Darren's point, I mean, in political terms, I mean, economics think tanks like ourselves will sort of say, you know, here's a supply-side reform plan for, you know, much higher economic growth over the course of the next 40 years. And, you know, I'd like to think that's a worthy contribution to debate. But the Prime Minister wants to do something in the next 40 minutes, right?
It's, I mean, there's a...
I mean, he keeps saying, I'm going to have an announcement in a couple of days' time. Weeks go by.
There's a general election coming down the line, so if I was in a political position, I'd want something short and sweet to sell, and that's probably what they'll be looking for, short-term answers that can get them on the front foot.
Victoria, you mentioned earlier about the independence of the bank. Has that come into disrepute? It seems to me it emphatically has. When the bank was set up, it's very clear it's got one club in its golf set: interest rates, one ambition, keep inflation under control. I mean, you can argue whether that's a sensible way to construct your banking system or not, but it's at least pretty clear. And they haven't used the one club in their golf set. They just keep writing to the, you're supposed to keep inflation between 2 and 3%. You write a sort of humble letter to the Chancellor, don't you, if you're the Governor of the Bank of England, you've missed that target. But I mean, that's just on Control-C, Control-V at the moment, right? I mean, just the same letter every month for months and months and months.
To some extent, they do have another tool in the toolkit, which is to simply stop quantitative easing sooner. That's a sort of, obviously, I'm looking back with 2020 hindsight there, but they have both a forward and a back, if you like, and they've only been using the forward, and maybe they could have taken the foot off the pedal on the money printing rather sooner than they did before they had to now, or before they are now in the position of having to apply the brakes. But I think in terms of central bank independence, I was just discussing this with my boss, James Forder, today. He's been vindicated on this because he has said for a long time the only reason for central bank independence is to give credibility to monetary policy, and the markets will be reassured by the fact that there's essentially an independent expert at the helm, and that gives credibility to commitments around controlling
Which
inflation.
early doors seem to happen, right? When Blair won and Brown announced it. I mean.
Yes, but that's when times were good, and it was actually quite easy to do that. As soon as it came under pressure, I think it's fair to say that the credibility argument seems to have been lost.
Lucy, do you think there's just going to be lots of finger pointing here? The Governor of the Bank of England's going to point at
the Governor of the
Putin
Bank of England is already pointing at ordinary people, saying to businesses, don't raise wages, don't ask for a pay rise. But it's inevitable. It's absolutely inevitable.
You can't blame people for inflation.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that Andrew might get a pay rise at some point in the near future. Maybe, who knows? It could be something I could suspect would happen, knowing how these things go. But look. Ordinary people, you've had this, there's more jobs available, there's not enough people taking them up, so there's a surplus of jobs out there. So obviously companies are going to have to attract people by pushing up wages. And then the cost of living crisis as well on top of that, people will ask naturally for more money. So he's got to accept that is going to happen. And if that's going to happen, what's your plan? Andrew?
Darren, I'm run an economics think tank, but I'm not a forecaster. But I'm willing to put out a little bit of, things could end up far worse than we presently see at the moment. The kind of, inflation's going to, top out at 9% and then it will start falling back. Maybe, as I say, I'm not a forecaster, but it seems to me there is a possible future in which we get up to 15% inflation. I don't know, 20% for all the reasons Lucy said. Pay will go up, everybody's going to demand more, and it's this, again, catch the tiger by the tail, nearly impossible.
We end up fueling some domestic inflation. Also really interesting today, what's one of the main drivers for food price inflation is clearly been the war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine, two of the largest wheat producers in the world. Today, or yesterday, I think, India, because there's a kind of ridiculous heat wave at the moment, so it's going to ban wheat exports.
Right.
There are things that are unforeseen that could very easily feed into this. To kind of bring my more kind of political hat to all of this, though, it's really interesting the kind of tensions that you see between the Treasury, Rishi Sunak, who frankly is making the argument of we shouldn't fuel all of this inflation. We need a bit of economic pain to dampen this down. Indeed. And you've got Boris Johnson, who, unbelievably loves spending money and just wants to get through the next day and will just agree to whatever. And at the moment, that's where we are, definitely on the windfall tax on energy companies. The Treasury thinking that's going to set a bad precedent. It also obviously falls into a Labour trap. But for Boris, frankly, he needs an answer, and that seems a very obvious answer. And he's a populist to many degrees. It's very popular with the public. Unbelievably, 4 out of every 5 people look at Shell and BP making billions and billions and billions of pounds worth of profit, and they go, hold on a moment, why are they making this money, which they didn't think they were going to make, and our bills are going up? It doesn't make sense. So I think in the end, it's more likely than not that Boris will probably row in behind it, simply because politically, even though economics it's a different argument. Politically, it's probably the one easy answer.
Lucy, do you think that will happen? I mean, I think most of my colleagues here at the IEA are opposed to windfall taxes.
Yeah,
Also, I mean, corporation tax is sort of a windfall tax, right? We do tax profits of companies, and if your profits go up, you obviously pay more corporation tax. But I get very, very nervous. I can hear what Darren's saying on the short-term, attractive, popular political fix.
Yeah.
But once you start getting politicians deciding that company's unpopular, so their profits are going to be taxed more than this company, which is a bit more popular, or do you start subsidising? I mean, it wasn't that long ago when the barrel was worth more than the oil in it. We didn't then subsidise the energy companies. It would be a pretty dangerous step, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, everyone can agree that there has to be an intervention at this point, I think. You can't leave this to get worse and worse. Whether that's through a windfall tax or whether it's not is an outstanding question, I suppose, for those who are in a significant position of power to reduce, pain on families across the board. But like I said before, is this something that is applicable to larger companies who could then reinvest into their companies? It's one of those things where there are short-term gains but long-term pains when you're doing this type of thing. And I think it's going to be an incredibly difficult conversation between the Treasury and Boris to work out exactly which direction they want to go. It's true, it is incredibly popular with the general public who have had to sacrifice the last 2 years of their lives to COVID-19 and think they've already made enough sacrifices. So with Andrew Bailey saying you've got to have another sacrifice, take one for the team, are they then going to take another for the team for the larger and longer term economy? Probably not. So I would say that as a politician, you'd probably look at this with a bit of some greedy eyes.
Okay,
Maybe Andrew can take a second job.
Yes, second job, Andrew.
I want to finish by putting to each of you just a theory I've got, and I'm an old man now. I just recently turned 50. And I was sort of yearning again for the 1990s.
I'm not sure that's the definition of old.
Pretty much.
Everyone was silent.
Pretty
No one
much.
said no. What are you talking about?
And I was sort of reflecting over my 50 years on the planet and started yearning for the 1990s, in which, as far as I recollect, basically nothing happened. We all just got richer. It was a successful
Peter
time for the
Andre
economy.
happened? What are you talking
Peter
about?
Andre happened. There were some crises, indeed.
Cool Britannia.
Whereas at the moment, and Darren, do you feel this in the news media? I'm not blaming the media for it. It might be a reflection of what's actually happening, but we seem to now be in permanent crisis, right? So, Brexit, oh my God, that's going to be a crisis. And then COVID, so we're going to spend money to deal with that. And now the cost of living crisis, as if there is never a year when the sun is shining at which you might fix the roof. There's only years of different types of rain.
I finished my postgraduate in journalism the year that Lehman Brothers collapsed and the financial crisis hit, and ever since then it feels that we've never been on a proper tiller, really.
Normality has not returned.
Yeah, we've had a
at
kind of
least.
recovery, and then, as you say, COVID hits, we've got a war on, and people keep on banging on about monkeypox, which is slightly disconcerting. But yes, you're right, as in, yes, it does feel like we're in a kind of perennial crisis. All I would say, though, and it is disconcerting, and there are a lot of people suffering, is, I don't know, you'll not remember this, no, very few people, thankfully, but it's not the 1970s. I don't think we've quite hit the 1970s.
Do you really think? I think we're heading
Really?
there at speed in our targets.
Well, I hope not,
we
I
are
hope
returning back to the 1970s at speed.
Because that was like genuinely bad. And our politics also has been in massive flux since the financial crisis, and there is no sign of that settling down either.
Victoria, do you think we're in just permanent crises of one form or another? There's never going to be a normal year again. It's going to be COVID or cost of living or Trump or Brexit or monkeypox. God knows what else.
I'll slightly push back on your rose-tinted view of the 90s. Don't forget the 90s was when Tony Blair and New Labour first started setting about vandalising our constitution, introducing...
Bringing in a big old topic right towards the end, Victoria.
we did have Mr. Blobby on the TV though. In the 90s.
Some big upsides to offset it.
So perhaps in some ways that was when the rot set in, and it was sound economic policy was thrown out the window in those times. But I'm not particularly optimistic about positive things happening in our economy in the coming months and years, I must admit.
So I'm going to stay with my rose-tinted glasses. What do you think, Lucy? I was asking, I won't name them, but a Conservative Member of Parliament who's been in Parliament, I think 1992, and he was at a dinner in which he was asked, well, you're long-serving MP now, who has been your favourite right-wing Prime Minister in that time? And without hesitation, he said Tony Blair. Which I think tells you rather a lot, doesn't it? I mean, Lucy, let me finish with you. We're just in permanent crisis all the time now.
Well, look,
no, when is normality going to come back?
I think there is normality. It's just the people who are reporting don't see it because they're too busy.
It's all Darren's fault.
Sorry, too busy reporting things that are abnormal to get the headlines. But I think there is a silver lining here, and the more there are top-line conversations about big, flashy news articles, behind the scenes, people in pubs, families are having discussions on the detail. They're making sure that the important things are discussed, and they're making everyday decisions from those discussions. If only I think those people in charge could learn from them. So there is a silver lining.
Let's finish on a silver lining. Thanks, Darren, Victoria and Lucy, for being my guests this evening. My thanks too to Claire Fox, our earlier guest. Thanks to everybody watching at home. If you've enjoyed the show, remind you again, hit that thumbs up button, the subscribe banner and the notification bell. If in these troubled times you've got a few pennies spare and can help us keep the lights on, which is becoming more and more expensive, please do consider becoming an IEA online patron. Details are in the show notes below. Huge thanks to our top tier IEA online patrons: Donald Blaney, James Burns, Jordan Grover, Mark Edwards, Philip Ozu, Richard Leader, Robert Appleby and Timothy Worrell, and to many others at the lower tiers as well. I've got a confession now. My treat to myself, having recently turned 50, is I'm going to take a very long summer holiday beginning next week. But fear not, the show will go on live without Littlewood. We'll be back on air with guest presenters every other Wednesday for much of the summer. So I hope you've enjoyed the show. Stay safe, stay free. Over and out.